Frank DeLuca had been playing Family Feud for 42 minutes against a family he had been quietly, privately, professionally destroying. He was 63, a former high school football coach from Scranton, Pennsylvania, the kind of competitive man who approaches a game show with the same methodology he brought to third down conversions: deliberate, analytical, relentless. He had buzzed in first on 11 of 16 questions. He had gotten 9 of them correct. His family was ahead by 114 points with 1 round to play. He had been feeling, in the way that competitive men feel when they are winning, entirely correct about the world. And then Steve Harvey, who had spent the last 42 minutes in possession of information that had been delivered to him in writing at 6:45 in the morning, and that he had been holding with the care of a man who knows that certain information can only be released once and must be released correctly, walked to the center of the stage between rounds 4 and 5 and said, "Frank, I need to stop the game for a second, because there's something you don't know about the family you've been playing against." Frank DeLuca said, "What's that?" And Steve Harvey said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "The young man at the other podium, the one you've been out playing all morning. His name is Daniel. He's 29 years old. And his last name, Frank, is DeLuca." Frank DeLuca stopped breathing for 60 seconds. The cameras confirmed it. His chest did not move. And then he turned toward the other podium, and he looked at Daniel DeLuca. And Daniel DeLuca looked back at him, and both of them stood completely still, and the Family Feud stage held 60 years of a story that had never had the right room to be told in. Until now. It was a Thursday in July, taping day at ImageWorks Studios in Atlanta. Frank DeLuca had come with his wife of 32 years, Carol, their daughter Michelle, their son-in-law Greg, and Frank's older brother Sal, who had been cajoled into the trip by Carol, and who had spent the green room time complaining about the drive and the parking and the green room chairs, none of which prevented him from being deeply, visibly engaged the moment the cameras came on. They were a Scranton family in the fullest sense, loud, warm, argumentative in the way that families who have shared decades of dinner tables are argumentative, with the specific bond of people who have survived things together and stopped needing to mention them. The opposing family had arrived separately. Daniel DeLuca, 29, a carpenter and part-time college student from Philadelphia, had come with his mother, Christine, her sister Rosa, Rosa's husband Miguel, and a family friend named Earl. Daniel was a quiet young man with a precise way of answering questions that his mother said he had always had, even as a child, he thought before speaking, which she had always found remarkable in a kid, and which she now understood was the thing that made him good at his work. He was good with his hands and with his words, and with the specific patience required to build things correctly, and he had grown up with a father-shaped absence that Christine had navigated by simply never lying about it. She had told Daniel his father's name when Daniel was 7. She had told him his father did not know Daniel existed. She had told him that the circumstances were complicated, and that the absence was not about him. Daniel had accepted this with a calm that had worried her slightly, and that she had eventually understood was not resignation, but the processing style of a child who takes things seriously. Frank DeLuca had met Christine Rossi in 1993. They had been together for 4 months. Christine had left Scranton for Philadelphia in the 3rd month for reasons that were her own, and that she had never fully explained to Daniel except to say that the relationship had not been built for the long term, and that she had made a decision that felt right at the time. She had not known she was pregnant when she left. She had discovered it 6 weeks later. She had decided to have the child and to raise him in Philadelphia with her family around her, and without involving a man she had not spoken to in 6 weeks, and who she believed had moved on. She had been wrong about almost all of her assumptions, except the one about her capacity to raise a child. That one had been accurate. Daniel had submitted the DNA sample at 26, using a consumer ancestry service, on the recommendation of a friend who had found a half-sibling through the same database. The match had come back in 2 weeks. A high-probability paternal match in Scranton, Pennsylvania. A man named Frank DeLuca. Daniel had spent 3 months figuring out what to do with the information. He had written 2 letters and not sent either. He had searched his father's name online and found a newspaper article about a regional football championship from 2009. A photograph of a man on a sideline with his arms raised, and he had looked at the photograph for a long time and said nothing to anyone. His Aunt Rosa had submitted the Family Feud application. She had done it because Rosa was the kind of person who solves problems by finding the largest available platform and placing the problem on it. She had told Daniel what she was doing. He had said, "Aunt Rosa, that's insane." She had said, "I know." She had submitted it anyway. The producers had called Frank DeLuca's family independently through a standard casting process and had arranged the scheduling with the precision of a team that understood they were handling something irreversible. Steve Harvey had been briefed at 6:45 in the morning and had spent 45 minutes alone before the taping began. Frank had been playing against Daniel for 42 minutes. Without knowing, the cameras had caught Frank watching Daniel's answers with the specific attention of a competitive man assessing his opponent, noting his precision, his speed, the way he thought before speaking, and had not caught Frank understanding why he was drawn to watching this particular young man more than the others. Some things are visible before they are known. Steve Harvey walked to the center of the stage between rounds 4 and 5. He said, "Frank, I need to stop the game." Frank said, "We're winning." It was so perfectly Frank DeLuca that 3 people in the crew laughed involuntarily. Steve said, "I know. I need to stop it anyway." He paused. "Because there's something you don't know about the family you've been playing against." He said Daniel's name. He said Daniel's last name. He said the words that connected the two. Frank DeLuca stopped breathing for 60 seconds. His wife Carol made a sound. She had not known. None of Frank's family had known. Carol put both hands over her mouth. Michelle, their daughter, took a step back from the podium as if needing physical distance to process the information. Sal said, in a voice that contained 30 years of Scranton in every syllable, "Oh my God." Frank turned slowly toward the other podium. Daniel DeLuca was looking at him. He had been looking at him since Steve Harvey said the name. He had the same jaw. He had the same stance at the podium. The forward lean. The weight on the left foot that Frank had been using for 42 minutes, and that Frank had presumably been using his entire life. Christine was beside Daniel with her hand on his arm, her eyes moving between Daniel and Frank with the expression of a woman who has been carrying a complicated truth for 29 years and is watching it resolve in a room she had not fully imagined. Frank DeLuca did not move for 60 seconds. The cameras measured it precisely. He stood at his podium with his chest not moving, his face doing something that required all of his attention to contain, and he looked at the young man across 14 feet of game show stage who had his jaw and his stance and his way of thinking before speaking. And then his chest started moving again, and he walked toward Daniel. He did not run. He was a 63-year-old football coach from Scranton, and he did not run. He walked with the steady forward pace of a man who has decided something and is executing the decision, and he crossed the 14 feet. And he stopped in front of Daniel, and he looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that had lost every competitive quality it had contained for the previous 42 minutes, "I'm sorry I didn't know." Daniel said, "You couldn't have." Frank said, I'm sorry anyway. And then Frank DeLuca put his arms around his son for the first time in his son's life, and Daniel DeLuca led him, and the studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey had walked to the edge of the stage. He sat down on the floor. He was not composed. He did not attempt to be. He said, after a long while, "Somebody give me a minute." He took several. When he stood, his face was what it was, and he looked at the room and said, "I have hosted this show for 23 years. I have never, not once, been in a room where something like this happened." He stopped. "I don't have a speech for this. I just have gratitude that I was standing here when it did." He spoke about his own father, about the specific shape of that relationship, its gaps and its presence, and what it had meant to him to understand, later in life, that fathers are complicated, and that complicated does not mean absent by choice. He said, "Frank didn't know. That matters. What he does next matters more." He looked at Frank, who was still standing close to Daniel, not touching him now but not moving away either. He said, "You've got a son who thinks before he speaks and builds things with his hands, and came to Atlanta on a Thursday to find you without knowing that's what he was doing. That's a good person. That's your person." He pulled out his phone and called a family counseling specialist he had worked with on 2 previous reunion cases. He arranged, on the stage floor, for 3 facilitated sessions for Frank and Daniel and their families, covered in full by Steve's foundation, designed to provide a supported structure for the initial months of a relationship that was beginning rather than resuming. He said, "This doesn't end today. It starts today. And starting things correctly matters." He announced both families would receive the full prize. He looked at Christine and said, "You raised a remarkable man. You gave him everything he needed, including the truth. That was the right call." Christine said, "I just tried to be honest." Steve said, "That's everything." The episode aired 8 weeks later. The 60 seconds of Frank DeLuca not breathing, captured simultaneously on 3 cameras from 3 angles, became the most analyzed sequence in the show's editing history. The clip reached 310 million views in 12 days. The hashtag #HeDidn'tKnow was used in 41 countries. A documentary filmmaker contacted the production company within 72 hours of the clip going viral, requesting access to follow Frank and Daniel's story. The families declined. They said the next part was theirs. 3 months after the taping, Frank and Daniel DeLuca had met privately 4 times. Once in Philadelphia, where Frank had sat in Daniel's apartment and seen the tools he used for his carpentry work and had said, without preamble, "I used to build things." Before coaching, "I built furniture." Daniel had not known that. They had talked about it for 2 hours. Once in Scranton, where Daniel had met Carol and Michelle and Sal, who had cried, which surprised everyone because Sal had been presenting himself as a person who did not cry since approximately 1987. Once at a Philadelphia Eagles game, because Daniel was an Eagles fan and Frank was a Giants fan, and this had apparently been an immediate and significant area of conflict that both men found extremely funny. A year after the taping, Frank DeLuca attended Daniel's college graduation. He sat in the 4th row. He wore a tie. He brought Carol, who brought flowers. When Daniel crossed the stage and accepted his diploma, he found Frank in the 4th row and raised his diploma in his direction. Frank stood up. He was the only person in the 4th row who stood. He did not care. Today, Frank DeLuca has a photograph on his refrigerator. It is from the Family Feud taping, taken by a production photographer in the moments after Frank crossed the stage. It shows Frank and Daniel standing close together, not quite touching, looking at each other. Frank is 63 in the photograph. Daniel is 29. They have the same jaw. Frank printed it the week after the taping. He has not moved it since. If this incredible story of a father, a son, and 42 minutes of a game show they did not know they were playing together moved your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to start. Have you ever found someone you didn't know you were looking for? Share your story in the comments. Because as Frank and Daniel proved, sometimes the most important moment is the one where you stop breathing for 60 seconds and then start walking.